Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight will be part 2 in my ongoing series of my book recommendations. If you missed part 1, go back and check it out so you certainly don't miss any. Now, for part 2 of my ongoing recommendations, let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. The first book that I recommend is Deviant, the shocking true story of Ed Gein, the original Psycho by Harold Schechter. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Harold Schechter, to me, is one of the greatest true crime authors of all time. I own all of his books and will continue to own all of his books as he puts out more. This book in particular, Deviant, goes over Ed Gein. For those who aren't familiar with him, Ed Gein has been the inspiration for so many Hollywood horror movies. The thing is, everything in those movies is basically just fiction. However, what Ed Gein did was what happened in real life, which is so much scarier. So this book in particular goes over the grisly true story of Ed Gein, the killer whose fiendish fantasies inspired Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, the mild-mannered farmhand bound to his domineering mother, driven into a series of gruesome, bizarre acts beyond all imagining. In chilling detail, Deviant explores the incredible career of one of the most twisted madmen in the annals of American crime, and how he turned a small Wisconsin farmhouse into his own private playground of ghoulishness and blood. What I also like about this book is it doesn't just stop when Ed Gein is caught. It goes over what happens after to this Wisconsin small town. So many people, thousands of people, flooded to this farmhouse to see what was happening, to see if they could see anything, get a piece of the farmhouse. This has been going on in interest in true crime so much longer than we think. There was just no social media back then to capture it. And what his crimes did to the small town, again, so many people flooded this area, as well as so many reporters. It completely turned this area upside down. And he does a really good job in capturing the aftermath of what his crimes did to the community. So again, Deviant, the shocking true story of Ed Gein, the original Psycho by Harold Schechter. The second book of my book recommendations are Depraved by Harold Schechter. It is the definitive true story of H.H. Holmes, whose grotesque crimes shattered turn-of-the-century Chicago. There are so many other books as well on H.H. Holmes, some that focus a bit more on the Chicago World Fair. This one does a little bit because it is part of the story. However, I prefer more about H.H. Holmes, and that's why I prefer this book over others. So for those who are not familiar with H.H. Holmes, this book kind of goes over how H.H. Holmes built his own home with, it was basically a madhouse of trapdoors, asphyxiation devices, bloody chutes, and acid vats, and when it was exposed. The seminal profile of a homegrown madman in the era of Jack the Ripper, Depraved is a mesmerizing tale of true detection long before the age of technological wizardry. So this book does, again, touch on the Chicago World's Fair because this happened within miles of that location. I would really recommend this because it goes into detail of the home that H.H. Holmes built. And it was purposeful, and I don't want to give too much away if you're not familiar with it. It's shocking and crazy how he planned this out so meticulously. But go ahead and check it out. Harold Schechter's Depraved, the definitive true story of H.H. Holmes, whose grotesque crimes shattered turn-of-the-century Chicago. The third book of my book recommendations for tonight is Dahmer's Confession, The Milwaukee Cannibals' Arrest Statements by John Borowski. This book, I recommend it, but I will give caution. It's a bit of a dry read because it is the actual police reports from the two detectives who interviewed him, and they go in order. So it will give the report from the first officer who interviewed him, because there was two at the time when Dahmer was first caught. So it gives that report, his write-up, and then it immediately goes into the write-up of his partner. So you essentially read almost the same thing twice back to back. Obviously, each detective had their writing styles were a little bit different, but for the most part, you essentially read the same thing. So it's a little bit dry on that end. However, it really gives you insight into what happened day to day, because they spent weeks interviewing Jeffrey Dahmer. And that's captured and it goes in order. So we know the aftermath, but we don't know what the detectives were learning each day. And this captures that because it's their actual reports. I'm not sure if the camera will pick this up, but as my cats go crazy. But it goes into that. And it has also some at the end I could have personally done without is some fan art people have done of Dahmer. Again, I could do without that, but it also has some articles that appeared in the paper at the time before the Jeffrey Dahmer trial. And that I like because those were original articles, or copies of them, I should say, from back when he was caught. So I'd like to see those in here to see how it was being reported to the media, what happened after he was caught, what happened after what police found, and then they realized there was so much more to what Jeffrey Dahmer was doing with his crimes. So I do recommend this, but warning, it's repetitive, but it's meant to be. So just keep that in mind. I didn't quite get that when I first ordered it and got it, but it's purposeful and it's for a reason. So Dahmer's Confession, The Milwaukee Cannibals Arrest Statements by John Borowski. The next recommendation in my part 2 series is, going off of that, Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal by Patrick Kennedy and Robin Maharaj. And I hope I pronounced that last name correctly. I tend to mispronounce a lot. So this book is more of covering what was in there, because actually Detective Kennedy was one of the arresting officers that his reports were in that first Dahmer book that I just covered. So it doesn't recap word for word the report. It's more of what happened at the time, generally speaking. And Robin is a freelance journalist who covers this book with him as well. In a nutshell, what this book is about is Grilling Dahmer. The reader is taken on a horrifying tour into the mind of evil as Kennedy patiently and meticulously listened to unspeakable horrors so that a monster would be taken off the street forever. And one thing in this that Kennedy does is he describes what techniques he used to make Jeffrey Dahmer so comfortable with him. Because that's one thing that is noted, that Jeffrey Dahmer became so comfortable and trusting of these detectives that even when the detectives thought, okay, we're done, Jeffrey Dahmer would over and over again want to speak with them, want to clear his conscience, want to get all details of his crimes out. And that's just some good detective work that they did, that they were able to build that rapport with Dahmer so that Dahmer trusted them, so they could get all that information for the victims' families. So I would suggest this in 2 parts. Reading the first book where you just get the straight up police interrogation notes, and then this book where it sums it up, but then goes a little bit deeper into what Detective Kennedy ultimately went through. And it talks about the aftermath of what happened, because this field has a very high burnout rate, as you can imagine. And what type of toll that this, and especially a case of this magnitude, puts on a person and on the person's psyche. So this book does a great job in talking about that. So I would say definitely check this out. If you were only to pick one, I would say pick this Dahmer book. And again, it's Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal by Patrick Kennedy and Robin Maharaj. So check that out. The 5th and final book of my part 2 book recommendation for tonight is Member of the Family My Story of Charles Manson, Life Inside His Cult, and the Darkness That Ended the 60s by Diane Lake and Deborah Herman. So this book, for those who are not familiar with the Manson case, Diane Lake was one of the members of the Manson commune, and this is her story of what happened. And keep in mind, Diane Lake was only 14 at the time, so she was not only underage, but very, very young. And this book also, not only does it give her truth about what happened in her experience with the Manson commune, but it does a fantastic job of talking about the times, what was going on at the time. This was not the first commune she was in. This goes over her upbringing from her family, which is tragic in itself, and she doesn't hold back anything. And then it goes to when her and her family went to other communes, and then she branched out with her parents' permission to go on her own and join the Manson commune. So this does a really, really great job in showing the beforehand, what was her life like leading up to the Manson commune, what it was like there, and then the aftermath, because there's a reason that she came forward with her story, and that is in this book as well. So I would definitely check that out. Again, this is her story, her truth. There are so many different theories on the Manson case, so I know not every Manson book is for everybody, and I understand that. So just keep that in mind when you read this. This is her perspective. And again, she was only 14 at the time, so she was a very, very young child when this happened. So keep that in mind when you're reading this. So again, I would recommend Member of the Family, My Story of Charles Manson, Life Inside His Cult, and The Darkness That Ended the 60s by Diane Lake. So thank you for sticking around for part 2 of my book recommendations. Do you have any questions or comments on these books? Well, leave it down below and I'll do my best to answer them. Do you have any book recommendations? Please list them down below. In part 1, you guys put some excellent book recommendations in the comments. So much so that my Amazon wish list right now is flooding with books. And with the holidays coming, I pretty much know what I'm going to be asking family to get me if they say, do you have any ideas? Yes, all these true crime books, please. So leave your book recommendations down below. And do you have any suggestions for any upcoming Danny After Dark cases that you'd like me to cover? Well, leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.